Hello everybody and welcome to an automation automotive design exercise. Today we are making a plea to our friends at Nissan to please bring back the S chassis. You may not know what you are looking at here, but the game that we are in is called Automation, the Car Company Tycoon game. And it not only will eventually be a fantastic tycoon-based game where you can build your own car company, it is also a great sandbox to explore your own automotive design skills, techniques, ideas, thoughts, etc. Today we are going to use this particular body that I have already modified quite significantly in order to make a spiritual successor to the 1998 Nissan 240SX. And if you're not familiar with me or my history, my automotive history, the 240SX is something that is very important to me and is something that has pretty much defined my life for the past 10 years or so. Everything I do that is hobby-based and hopefully soon professional-based is based off of stuff I have learned or have gained interest in based off of owning and driving and racing 240SXs. So those cars mean a lot to me, and it would mean a lot to me to see a spiritual successor to that. In the late 90s and early 2000s, the Japanese manufacturers in general kind of got away from the sports coupe. It took a while to even get a successor to the 300ZX, to the Z model lineup. Now that car and that model history, it has a much bigger presence in American car culture. The 240Z is something that people remember and recognize, as is the 300ZX. Interestingly, when the 240SX was first introduced, although it sold like hotcakes, it never gained the kind of cult following that the Z cars had initially. It took 10, 15 years for that to happen. But now it has. With the Gran Turismo, Need for Speed, and Fast and Furious generation, these cars became icons. And what's interesting to note there is that generation, my generation, we're getting old now. And we're getting to the point where we can afford to buy real cars, new cars. And what are we buying? We're buying BRZs, FRSs. We're buying Genesises. We're buying the new ND Miata. I see a lot of people excited about that. Nobody's buying 370Zs because that's not the same car. It doesn't have the same feeling to it. It's just not, it's not an S chassis. Or, if you're crazy like me, you're buying a Solstice. So I say now is the time. It is the time to build the spiritual successor to the 240SX. And not only is now the time is running out. We've got to do this now or it's never going to happen. So here's my thoughts on how they could do it. We'll go over items as the game goes through its, user interface layout, and you start out with the chassis. Obviously, it's going to be monocoque, that is, well, basically everything. And when it comes to the material of the chassis, I think it's important to keep this car two things: light and affordable. The thing that made the 240SX interesting to buyers was that it was a performance car that was light and somewhat affordable. Keep in mind, the original 240SX was not all of that cheap. It was not a car that I would call a budget car. So we make the material of the chassis just regular corrosive resistant steel. Engine placement, very important. It's got to be longitudinal. It's got to be rear-wheel drive or it just isn't going to work. Now when it comes to suspension, we need to do things that are not earth-shattering. So McPherson strut is probably fine for the front, and really we're still getting a lot of use out of this setup and can produce it very affordably. Even cars such as the direct competitor for a car like this right now, the Subaru BRZ, still use a traditional McPherson strut front end. And in the rear, I would say using the same setup that was found in the traditional 240SX, the multi-link setup would be just fine. And, the way the original 240 handled was basically its selling point. That, I think, is something that has kind of been glossed over time. But if you go back and you watch, your your Motor Weeks, your car and driver reviews, and stuff like that, that's what they talked most about. It was just a fun driving car. The panel material is interesting because it would probably be a mix between polymer and steel. That is the traditional way to do things nowadays. Unfortunately, the game doesn't have that option, so we're just going to go with steel, and we'll see what the weight ends up being. I have a number in mind that I want to meet, so if we can't meet that number with steel, then we'll change that. As far as the aesthetics of the car go, Nissan has a particular look in mind right now, so I'm going to try and stay close to that, but still make it something that is appealing to me. We're not going to be able to get super close to it, and I'm not in complete agreement with their current design scheme, so it might be a little different in the end. Alrighty, so using the current design motifs of the Nissan lineup and overall just current car design, I've come up with this body style. Now, this actually doesn't have a whole lot of ramifications to the point I'm trying to make. This is just a rough mock-up, something that I've made in the game, just showing that the current design scheme fits with Nissan and that it could work for a smaller coupe like this. As far as the actual car shape goes, this is probably the more important part to me. It needs to have the long hood. That, I think, is very important to the history of the car. A slanted windshield, not a stand-up windshield, which is okay because that seems to be kind of in the theme of Nissan's current lineup anyway. And then in the rear, I would actually hatchback this out even more if I could. Unfortunately, the body is limited in its morphing in that way, so that's as far as we can go with that. But yeah, I would hatchback it out as much as possible to make it the most usable car possible. Part of what I think was so popular about the original S13 240SX is that the hatchback was very useful. Even though the rear seats were there basically for show, that goes with any 2+2. You could fit pretty much anything into them, as much luggage as you needed, etc., and it made it a usable daily driver 2+2. The BRZ is somewhat like this, but its short greenhouse makes it a little bit difficult to work with, so maybe a little bit larger than that would be nice. Okay, now, remember we're working in the modern Nissan family company. We're not working in Fantasyland where we have an infinite budget and can just throw brand new engines into this car. I am going to use existing Nissan engines to put into this thing to show basically that they could do this and they could do it right now. Nissan/Renault have a 4-cylinder engine currently that is actually pretty well received. The old QR is gone. That engine was pretty much hated, and that would have been found in your Sentras and your base model Ultimas, I believe. Any of their 4-cylinder engines would be using that one. The MR lineup has come through and replaced that, and it features a MR18DE that is a 1.8 liter naturally aspirated engine that is fairly low output, but would be great for a base model car. And I think that's probably the most important part of this to me, is that it needs to be lightweight. So let's build the MR18DE real quick. Slight correction, is the MRA8DE. This is the basically higher performance version of that engine. And you can see it is aluminum blocked and has an 84 by 81 bore and strokes. So that means that it has a roughly 1.8 liter engine capacity, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you think about it, the 180SX basically came with a CA18, which had a 1.8 liter engine in it, And they did indeed have a naturally aspirated model of that as well. The bottom end is made of nothing overly fancy, just your normal cast iron crank, and then probably powdered metal conrods and hypereutetic cast pistons. Cast is basically a catch-all for that right now, and will be just fine for showing what the engine can do. It has a compression ratio of 9.9 to 1, so pretty high. It does indeed have EVT on the intake and exhaust. And in normal configuration, as it is found in, say, the Nissan Sentra, it has 130 horsepower. To me, that's not quite enough. That is your ND Miata numbers, and that works great for the Miata because it is so tiny and so light that it can get away with that, if you will. This car is going to be larger, and I don't think 130 horsepower would necessarily quite get you there. So if I was going to beg Nissan to do one thing with this engine, it would be to carry over the direct injection that the turbo engine has over to the NA version so that we could performance it up a little. 150, I think, is the bare minimum horsepower this engine would have to have. Using direct injection and a more aggressive cam profile, 56, we were able to get this engine already up to 151 horsepower, although I think max power 155. No, we're all good here. So basically just adding that direct injection let us use a higher compression ratio and a higher cam profile, still on regular fuel, 86.5 regular. We were able to get 151 horsepower. Now, if we use our little time machine in our heads, we will go back to 1991. The Nissan 240SX with a KA24DE made about 155 horsepower to 160 horsepower. Keep in mind, that's 155 horsepower with 2.4 liters and a cast iron blocked aluminum head engine. So it was a much heavier engine and a much larger displacement engine. I also noticed this is making peak power right at the red line, so I'm going to increase that. Aha! And what do you know? We do indeed gain some horsepower. So at about 6,900, this bottom end starts to become a little displeased with life. So we'll keep it at 6,900 for now. Actually, no. 7,100 I think is okay, because once you start getting yellow, that still is within reason, and our reliability is still super high. It's now 156 horsepower. And I really do believe that that is easily obtainable with an engine like this. Alright, so there we go. There is our base model engine. So let's go ahead and put this in the car and see what kind of performance we can get out of it. Now, I am a purist, so I believe that all sports cars should come with at least an optional manual. So that's the version I'm going to build initially. A 6-speed manual, just a regular, foot-activated clutch, no floppy paddles. We can add that on later if we see fit. Disregard these values just yet because we need to go ahead and go to the tire tab and let's put some tires on here, and we'll put sports compound on it for now. We'll put 17s. And now's the part where I remember that I forgot to stretch out the front fenders. 235, that should be more than enough. And back to the trim. Okay, so 235s up front. And then maybe 245s in the back. That's actually probably too much, I think. Yeah, let's tone that down just for this base model, because that's a lot of tire for a 150 horsepower car. It's too much. Okay, I think that looks fine, and we can offset those. All right, now it's looking like something. Now it looks a little bit more like like an actual sports car. We got to deal with the fender gaps because the car is up in the air and the suspension's at rest. Blah 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 blah. Anyway, on to some brakes. We'll just do regular vented discs. I think with just 2 pistons is probably more than enough for as light as the car is. So this right here is why I said don't pay attention to the top speed and stuff, because we got all this grille. Thanks modern car design. Wow, that really widened up that front, didn't it? Let's narrow that down, huh? Because that looks a little goofy. I didn't look at it from the front. So we only got to fit, what, 2 15s now? We can narrow that back up. There we go. That's right. Yeah, that's a little better. And then I got to make sure I choose. Okay, that's all set. But as I was saying, We had way too much cooling airflow with these huge grills. With the new car design, it's a matter of the hood having to be a certain height. It has to be very tall for the pedestrian, blah, 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 getting hits, blah, 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 blah. So manufacturers are using these huge grills and large grill openings to try and cover up the fact that it has this huge front end. So that's the large amount of grills. Okay, so there's enough cooling for the engine. Although it doesn't visually look like it, this will be a 2+2. And we'll just do a standard interior with basic infotainment system, power steering, ABS, and traction control because, I don't know, most standard sports cars nowadays are coming with traction control. And we'll do standard 2010 safety because we want to keep this car affordable. That's the key. We'll just do regular springs, gas monotubes with just regular passive sway bars, a sport style suspension. We'll tune this as needed. Did we get some base values? We did. Okay, so the car weighs 2830 right now. Subaru BRZ is right at 2800, so we're close. We're in the ballpark there. I found the brake discs to be far too large. They were just, braking a much faster, heavier car. So we brought that down, brought the weight down to 2762, so that's pretty good. Now let's go here and adjust our transmission. And let's give it a nice healthy overdrive there in 6th gear. Let's see what we can do with the spacing. As far as the spacing goes, you try and get 2nd gear to hit 60 if possible. Sometimes it's not really possible or plausible with a 6-speed box. It's actually, yeah, right about there is getting us our best 0 to 60 time of 7.4. And we're getting 28 miles per gallon. That's not too shabby. So there we go. Basically using an existing Nissan engine, maybe with a new gearbox behind it. I don't know if their 350Z one would be up to the job or too heavy, too over the top. But using essentially a drivetrain they already have, we've made a Nissan-based sports coupe that I think would be pretty much in line with the spirit of the original 240SX. Now, you couldn't just leave it here. I don't think this car on its own would be enough to have an impact on the market. The BRZ has already really put its foot down into this market. The Miata, the ND Miata, has already put its foot down in this market. So what we could do from here is I will make a new trim based off of this one. And since this is dragging on and you've seen the car building process now, let me actually build this out. So those Nissan Renault guys also have this at their disposal, the MR16 DDT, which is found in things such as the Nissan Juke, the Juke RS Nismo, the Renault Sport Clio, so they're performance hot hatches. So just flip this guy around to be rear-wheel drive, put it in this SX16, the, S16, quote-unquote, and what you've got yourself is an engine that is very small, efficient, and still able to produce more power than the BRZ. So what do you do with the SCR to really kind of separate it from the pack? You give it a regular geared LSD instead of a viscous. You put some nice wide tires on there, 235, 245s. You give it a small increase in brake, rotor size, but you don't go crazy and go full ceramic or anything like that, just regular vented discs. You maybe put a little rear downforce on there since, we're going a lot faster now. Keep it light, but put a sportier interior in the thing. And then maybe with the suspension, go back to the days of trying to do some innovative things there. We had the Super Hikits version of the S13. So maybe put some adaptive dampers or something like that to try and separate it from the herd. It might make it a little bit more expensive than your BRZs, but you have the base model priced below that to kind of separate the market out a little. So there we go. Now we have a higher performance model that is below the 370Z. That's important, but is, I believe, above the BRZ. And then you have a base model that is cheaper than, say, your BRZ or FRS, and maybe a little bit more practical than a Miata. It's the best combo you could have right now. It's the only way you could do this right now, And like I said, time is running out. The sports car market is probably not going to be as strong as it is right now for the foreseeable future. Electric cars are going to start to take over. Hybrids are already taking over. The time is now. If it's not now, it's never going to happen. I'm not saying sports cars are dead. In the fun to drive, gas-powered, simple sports 2+2 terms, the time is running out. And just some quick stats here. The SCR version would be doing, 14's quarter mile, 0 to 60 in like the 6.5 range. And although those numbers are not staggering or not mind-blowing, I think people are starting to realize, people are starting to get excited about drivers' cars again, not just straight line speed. And that's real exciting because you can produce cars like this that people will be excited about, that are cheap to insure, cheap to drive. This thing still gets 30 miles per gallon, and I'm sure that would be easy to pull off. Have decent power, but are mostly centered on being fun to drive. So there's my design exercise for the day, showing that it's possible. So let's do this thing, Nissan. Let's produce a new SX vehicle. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you next time. This engine was in before we bought it, before we bought it. He's the money man of this. I'm just the working hands. And we drove the car a little bit. It seemed everything was fine. And for a good while now, it has been fine. It's overall been running great. And then we had an issue. I'm not gonna be able to see it, unfortunately. You can see one of the braided lines right here, and it's similar to this braided line that's next to it. But there is a braided line for the oil feed for the turbo, underneath the turbo, that actually was rubbing up against this cast manifold and ruptured it. And that was a big problem. So we had to fix that, which involved completely removing the turbo and everything. It was a royal pain in the butt. And ever